As with the prior video, this is a set of concepts that you find pretty much elsewhere scattered through the text, but they're economic, and it seems like this is the place to have them. So they're all sort of moved over to here. So the first is the maquiladora. This was a huge part of the original NAFTA agreement when Canada, the US, and Mexico decided to make sort of a joint trade agreement back in I'm going to say the 80s. I don't remember when. And one of the main driving efforts was, for example, this idea, as I mentioned last time, of moving production to deal with labor cost. So basically chasing labor. And so what you had was as American corporations, and a good example would be, say, Harley Davidson, the motorcycle manufacturer, were saying by the 70s, 80s that they couldn't compete in the global market because the American cost of production was so high. So their argument was that if you were going to have these three countries work together collectively, then you had to have some way to allow American companies to move their production, usually to Mexico, since Canadian labor is about the same cost as US, and therefore remain globally competitive in selling their products, but also then keeping the image of the labor within North America, or more specifically the US. So the Maquiladora region, this is a 100-mile border. So it's 100 miles into Mexico from the US-Mexican border. That 100-mile strip is actually under the NAFTA. And from what I understand, the new agreement that was negotiated the last couple of years under the Trump administration hasn't changed this at all, because you have the same sort of driving factors in place, which is American production decision-making. And so what happens is that the agreement was that if I'm an American like Harley Davidson, if I'm a motorcycle manufacturer and I move my production of Harley Davidson motorcycles into northern Mexico within this maquiladora band, you might say, of Mexico, then I can still say that my motorcycles are produced in the United States. My labor force will be Mexican. My management force will pretty much be American. So that zone, that economic zone, is considered sort of like betwixt and between. It's in Mexico. It's under Mexican, subject to Mexican law. My understanding is if you're an American working for Harley in Mexico, your paychecks actually come out of Texas or wherever, something like that. So you're actually seen as working in Texas, even though actually you go to work in Mexico. So it's a sort of complicated thing, and it really didn't serve. I mean, it's one function, I suppose, was that it provided jobs for folks in Mexico, because otherwise the jobs would have moved overseas to probably Asia. But it makes life sort of complicated, because you see this a lot with Walmart or your Target or any place else. If it says made in the U.S., in a lot of those cases, the product, especially with clothes and things like motorcycles, Harley likes to portray itself or position itself as the great American motorcycle manufacturer. They don't make bikes in the US, they make bikes in Mexico. Ironically, Honda still makes a large proportion of their bigger motorcycles in a plant in Pennsylvania they did so they could be seen as an American manufacturer, though they don't really advertise that much anymore. So you end up in a sort of a weird situation. My Fiat, which is technically an American Fiat, my Barth, is actually made at the Fiat factory in Mexico. And that was put down there by Chrysler Fiat, for the purpose of using Mexican labor because it was cheaper, but they're still sold in North America as American-made Fiats, even though they're made in Mexico. It is what it is. So yeah, it's something to pay attention to, and something's made in the U.S. that's very likely not quite accurate. It's in this maquiladora zone, the sort of the gray area between the United States and Mexico. And of course, this has gotten very complicated because you have the whole issue, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, of illegal immigration and all sorts of stuff occurring in the same area, because it's such a sort of confused area for both the Mexican and American authorities trying to figure out what set of laws apply on what side of the border, when you've already said that it's both and neither. For economic production purposes, just makes life even more complicated than it would be before. Also means the United States and Mexico are much more symbiotically linked production-wise than we tend to think of, especially in the United States. There's a stereotype of us and Mexico as something different, not if you're in production. Fair trade movement, you see this a little bit. This was sort of popular, 3, 5, 6 years ago. It's sort of vanished off the radar. You still see stuff that are advertised as fair trade, but it's not as big as a deal as it was. And that's sort of a shame, because fair trade actually ties into things like, climate change and such like that in a rather complicated way. Because what fair trade did is basically it was the obverse of chasing cheap labor. In the fair trade system, what you did is someplace that was producing, you guaranteed the folks in that, for example, the most famous would be coffee in places like southern Mexico or Guatemala. If you're coffee farmers in Guatemala, then if you're in the fair trade system, what happens is that coffee, which is largely sold in the United States, the guy that buys in the United States guarantees that he's going to give you, the coffee farmer in Guatemala, a reasonable price for your coffee, which means you're going to make a hell of a lot more than you would if you sold it to one of, like Lipton, or I don't know who makes, I don't know, sells coffee, Nestle or whoever, one of the big coffee producers, who's going to pay you the minimal amount. So fair trade was basically the idea that you pay people a fair amount of money for the product that they're actually making. Now, the assumption of fair trade is if you logo something as fair trade, the folks that are the consumers, for example, the United States, America, Americans in the United States buying coffee, will be okay paying more for that coffee because they understand that buying that particular brand of coffee means that you're giving someone in Guatemala a living wage. So it directly links the consumer on one hand to the producer on the other hand. It's a great idea. The problem is, of course, it's not surprising if you pretend to be pretty cynical, and most farmers, I suppose, are, is that, of course, what happens is people, talk a good talk about wanting to do that, but when push comes to shove, they want their coffee as cheap as possible. Starbucks for a while was pretty big, and fair trade it's pretty much vanished from their shelves because they couldn't get people to buy it. It wasn't that they were against fair trade. Whole Foods, for example, still has some fair trade coffee and other products, but they don't advertise it the way they did even just a couple of years ago. And cynically, that's just because, farmers or, consumers, shoppers at Whole Foods don't give a squat. They just complain, oh, this coffee is so much more expensive. And no matter how much education you give, it's sort of like, yeah, I'd really like to help those farmers out, but I don't want to pay any more for their coffee. So again, it's this disconnect between the consumers on one hand in your very wealthy nations and the producers in the much poorer nations. And fair trade was an attempt to basically put a little more balance in that. But sad to say, there's the evidence, at least for the United States and to a certain extent Europe, is that doesn't work. Having said that, Chinese, ironically, and Japanese both tend to be pretty sensitive to fair trade. And you'll see a fair amount of products in Chinese markets and in Japanese markets that are certified fair trade, which is an international organization that certifies it. And they do fairly well. So ironically, if you're a Japanese consumer and you buy coffee, you very possibly will buy coffee because it's fair trade label. Consumers in the United States doesn't have it. I would argue it has something to do with American ethnocentrism too, but it's just beside the point. Just-in-time delivery. Just-in-time delivery, Amazon's probably the classic example of this, but you also see guys like Walmart and Target. One of the fascinating aspects of actually pre-COVID, but it's actually been exacerbated by COVID, is both Walmart and Target were actually becoming big competitors of Amazon in terms of just-in-time and basically online, automated delivery systems. And they've actually weathered the whole COVID thing really, really well compared to places like Macy's, which didn't do it and is now paying the price. This has two parts to it, and the just-in-time part was working really, really well until we ended up that log jam in the last year. That's, again, as I mentioned last time, has been a big issue right now in terms of products either not being made or the inability to get the products to their destination in a timely fashion. Prior to the 1990s, and this has to do with digitization, as everything moved from paper to digital format, what happened was your ability to send information just went up, incredibly quickly. It was almost instantaneous. Now, it didn't sink into folks initially, and I know because I originally started as a manager at Kmart, which was sort of the precursor to Walmart. Back when we were doing things, it was all paper. This is back in the dark ages. And so everything was paper, and you send in a paper order to the company that you bought stuff from, and then they would go and get the stuff. They'd put it in boxes and then send it to your warehouse, and then you'd stash it till you needed it. And so you had these enormous warehouses. Kmart's, for example, half of the floor space was actually, the whole thing was wrapped around this huge warehouse part. It was actually a big part of the store. And this, if you go to a Walmart, you won't see that. But that's because Kmart was the older system. In the Kmart system, what you had is the producers, the guys that made stuff, especially your secondary level, your production sector, would actually produce X amount of stuff, and they'd send this on. The quintessential example you still see here in Hawaii would be car dealers like Cutter, if you're Cutter Ford or something like that. You can ask Ford, you can tell Ford, we want these particular, colors or types of truck or something. But in reality, what you're going to get is a fair chunk of those trucks will just be whatever Ford happens to be making. So you might say, we can't sell green Ford trucks in Hawaii. And they'll just say, that's just tough because we made a lot of green trucks and you're going to get your quota, which means here, you've got 10 of them, you figure out how to sell them. That's the old style, where basically consumption was driven by who produced stuff. And if you produce stuff that didn't sell, then it ends up in Marshalls or Ross's. Back in the day, it ended up on sale. Or would be the loss leader would say Cutter Ford, where you say, oh, we're going to give these trucks, for almost nothing away. And the reason they're doing that is because they've been able to sell the damn things, but they didn't want them in the first place. They knew they wouldn't sell. Now, what happens in the 1990s when digitization starts to come in is now there's no time lag between what Cutter is selling and what Ford's producing. So Cutter can basically, and I'm sure they do, they send reports in every day on what they've sold. So the guys that are making trucks at Ford actually see what's being sold at Cutter, and they don't have any excuse for sending them 10 trucks. Now, why they do, I don't know. My suspicion is what you'd find is auto manufacturing's one of the last areas that's not just in time. So what happens if you're Walmart is you literally send in reports, twice a day from every Walmart store, and it goes back to the Walmart headquarters, and it's routed to whatever, whoever's making the stuff they have in the Walmart stores. And what Walmart then tells the producers, we'll say of shoes, that, in Hawaii, you can't sell brown shoes. So what that means then is they're going to tell them, don't send any brown shoes. But what they're also going to tell them is what we need 10, pairs of shoes next week. And because all this stuff is instantaneous, the factory has no excuse to not box up 10 pairs of shoes and send them to the Walmart store in Kamoku. So what happens is, whereas before the folks that made things basically told the retailers, here, you figure out how to sell this, which is the type of retail I grew up in. The retail you see now is the retailer basically tells the producer what to make. Now, we call this just-in-time delivery. And Walmart was the great success story of this. This is what made one of the things that made Walmart so dominant. This is why they totally wiped Kmart off the map. Kmart was way late to that game. They had their floor space was designed around the molder system, and they couldn't and didn't bother making the changes, and then killed them. And Sears is another example of the old system. Sears always had huge warehouses. So when you get into just-in-time delivery, where basically you can order stuff and it shows up. And if you want to see this classically, wander around the Whole Foods at Kahala Mall. And if you look at the area right behind the store where it's open, you realize they basically have almost no warehouse at all. There's almost no place to store stuff for that Whole Foods store. And that's because Whole Foods, which is now owned by Amazon, orders stuff every day with the expectation it'll get there and they'll know how many days lag it's going to be. But they order stuff so that it'll show up at the Walmart store and they plan on selling it in the next day or two, no matter what it is. It can be some pride good or whatever. So what happened, and this is the enormous change the last 30 years, has been the entire movement to just-in-time delivery. And it was working fantastically because it meant if you were a store, you didn't have to spend a lot of time on, making space up for warehousing. You didn't have to have warehouse employees. You weren't stuck with a bunch of stuff that might get damaged or go bad or whatever. So basically all that old stuff now disappeared, and you can see how little there is because if you think about it, the Ross's in Kahala Mall, there's Ross's all over the place. Those Ross's basically are what's left over of just-in-time delivery. So you order 10 orange shirts and you only sell 6. Well, rather than keeping them or putting them in a box and trying to sell them at, say, Halloween, what you do is you just dump those suckers on Ross's, take a little bit of a loss, and go and bring something else into the store to replace them on the racks. So just-in-time delivery is how things are done in the 21st century. But ironically, right around the COVID period for a bunch of shortages, and then of course labor shortages and distribution shortages and COVID, now that's just sort of turned into a train wreck because it requires that everything works smoothly. The information's still moving smoothly, but the ability to produce things and move them to where they're wanted is starting to get a stutter step. It's probably going to take another 6 months year before it sorts itself out. But just-in-time delivery is how things work nowadays. Now, just as a note, this becomes very scary if, for example, you had that hurricane not too long ago in the American South, especially Louisiana. You can see the downside of just-in-time delivery is that you don't have any surpluses. So you don't have warehouses full of water and full of this and full of that scattered all over the place. You might have 1 or 2, but you still now you've got to move stuff down there immediately because there's no stuff sort of being stashed already down there. So just-in-time delivery is incredibly profitable for companies that engage in it. But it does have a set of parameters, not the least of which is it's much more energy intensive in a lot of ways, because you're going to have to move in a lot of stuff, for example, by airplane versus by containers. Things have to move very quickly. So it's a very complex process, and there's all sorts of energy implications and pollution implications in just-in-time delivery. But I don't think anyone's ever going to go back to something else. Amazon's probably the sort of true 21st century example of just-in-time, and the fact that they have no place to go. If you want to see something that's being sold on Amazon, if you're lucky, you can find it maybe at a Walmart or Target and then buy it from Amazon. But if you want to actually see it in advance, you can't. That's the ultimate form of just-in-time delivery. You order it, bang, it shows up maybe 3 days or whatever, and it's done. Last of these is break a bulk point. This is a pretty simple concept. It's an entirely visual one, and this one of the things doesn't work very well, given the way this class is structured. This is online. But if you go to Google Earth, for example, or if you don't want to use Google Earth, go to Google Maps. But I'd recommend Google Earth. Go to Google Earth and look at where Singapore is. Singapore is an island country. It's an island. It's literally a small cluster of islands off the coast of Malaysia. It was part of Malaysia under the British Empire. Declares its independence when Malaysia declares independence because Singapore, under British rule, had largely become an enclave of Chinese. Chinese from largely Guangdong and Fujian, China, had moved down to Singapore in the earlier, but also especially in the 19th and 20th century under British rule, and basically set up as almost like a Chinese colony in Malaysia, which the majority population is Malay, not surprisingly. When Malaysia gets independence, they see Singapore as being the great goose that lays the golden eggs, because it's generating huge amounts of money, and wanted to remain theirs. And the folks in Singapore, since they are a minority in Malaysia, and Malays aren't particularly friendly with Chinese, they say, no, that ain't happening. So they actually make themselves an independent country. Now, the reason that Singapore can survive as an independent country is because it controls all movement of goods and services through the Straits of Malacca, basically between Southeast Asia and the Indonesian islands offshore. Everything pretty much being sold in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and even the eastern coast of the United States goes through that little tiny 15-mile wide gap that Singapore sits right on top of. And so what Singapore realized even before its independence was that if you set up a large chunk of that island and set it aside, what you could do is you could bring the factories that are producing stuff in Vietnam and China, etc., bring them down, bring all those containers down from the factories. So we'll say Foxconn and their iPhones that they're making for Apple. You bring all those, literally containers and containers of iPhones, you bring them down to Singapore. In Singapore, what you do is you take those containers and break the boxes out of them to move to London, and the boxes are going to go to Saudi Arabia, and the boxes are going to go to New York. So you sort all that stuff out to where its final destination is going to be in Singapore, because everything stops in Singapore. You then pile all the stuff in New York on one boat, phones and everything else. All the stuff that's going to go to London goes on another boat. And so this is what we call break of bulk. You take your production cycles, just basically coming down in massive loads of containers, you stop them in Singapore, you sort all the stuff out to its destination. And then Singapore is where you repackage it, if you would. You put it in new sets of containers that are now destination specific, and boom, off it goes. And the reason you can do that is because Singapore's geography is such that it's the logical place. Since everything has to pass there anyways, it's a logical place to get this done. And if you do it right, and they do, it doesn't take much time. Now, the thing is, this is entirely driven by your physical location on the planet. In other words, your geography related to your, both production on one hand and your consumers on the other. The best next place to Singapore, if stuff's going the other direction across the Pacific, is Honolulu. Because we're almost equidistant between northern Mexico, and the entire west coast is almost entirely equidistant with Honolulu. And that means that in many ways, we're exactly the Pacific Island counterpart of Singapore. Goods coming across the Pacific could stop here, be sorted out just like they're in Singapore, and then be routed to specific destinations, to LA or to Seattle or to Vancouver, BC, or Acapulco, Mexico, or wherever. And it's almost the same distance, so the cost is almost exactly the same. Back in the 1980s, the Singapore government actually offered, if the state of Hawaii and the federal government could give up the 2/3 of Pearl Harbor they don't use, because the Navy doesn't use center lock or west lock. The Navy only uses the east lock, or 1/3 of Pearl Harbor. Singapore proposed that the other 2/3 of Pearl Harbor be turned over to make a Singapore type container breakable location for basically Pacific Island goods. The state was totally in favor of it. The federal government was in favor of it. The US Navy did no. Pearl Harbor, as of today, is the only large harbor in the entire planet that's owned and controlled only by a military. No other facilities in the United States, in Russia, China, any place are controlled by military, just Pearl Harbor. So the United States Navy just totally single-handedly said, nope, ain't happening. We're not going to share. The state keeps on bringing this up. Singapore is actually funded about 15 years ago. They actually offered to pay the entire cost of building this out, which would actually be on existing, ex-military reservation lands. And ironically, it would actually help the US military, especially the Navy, because it would make it easier for the Navy to move stuff around. They still won't budge on it. Why this hasn't happened, I don't know. For you guys, the Chaminade students, it would mean that all of a sudden the number of high-paying local jobs would just skyrocket, because there's all sorts of related services, information services, distribution services. Every company that was somebody would have to have offices here in Honolulu, because that's where they're routing everything in and out. And all you have to do is look at the wealth of Singapore to think of what you'd get here. And all of a sudden, if, for example, you aren't a huge fan of tourism, it would give us an alternative to the tourism industry, with folks getting paid a lot more money to work a lot more equitable jobs. So break of bulk for much of the world is sort of a hypothetical thing you see in a text in a class like this. Here in Honolulu specifically, or Hawaii in general, it's actually a huge missing component that totally just makes for an insane situation. Now, if you buy something that's actually produced in China, it goes to Long Beach in LA, and then it's repackaged and shipped by Matson back to Hawaii. So that ship might literally come, it's passed within 100 miles of Honolulu. But before you actually get that product, it's gone another 5,000 miles, 2,500 to LA, and then 2,500 back to Honolulu to be sold. It's insane. So break of bulk, we're actually one of the other great world positions to do that, and we're not. And feel free to contact your state, and especially federal legislatures, and try to get that changed.